Snow squeaked under boot leather as if the ground were whispering a warning. The river wind climbed the hill and turned every breath into a thread of white vapor. A farmhouse window blinked twice and went dark. Beyond the hedgerow, someone counted heartbeats to match the rhythm of light. From the clappered church up the slope, a hymn slid through the night like water finding a seam in stone. Boots kept time where a drum would be, hands clapped slow and steady. No one sang North or Freedom. They sang Follow, Gourd, and Star. A mother pressed her lips to her child's ear and taught a new kind of alphabet. Breathe when the wind rises, freeze when it falls. At the tree line, a woman in a brown wool scarf kept a lantern low enough to be mistaken for a dying ember. Harriet counted the safe steps between pulses of glow and the breaths between distant barks. Memory, not a map, measured the night. Habit, not luck, kept the edges of fear from tearing. On the fence, a quilt leaned into the frost, triangles and zigzags pretending to be laundry. In daylight, it would be color. At midnight, it was a road. The tune in the church bent its notes like branches loaded with snow. A verse rose, a verse fell, and a door cracked just enough to show a silver ladle in heaven. The Big Dipper tilted toward Polaris, steady as a nail in the sky. No one pointed. A dozen pairs of eyes aligned themselves to an invisible line. Harriet closed her palm over the lantern glass to calm its flutter. Heat kissed her skin and left a crescent of fog in the air. They moved when the wind lifted and let it sweep their footprints into rags. They paused when the wind died and let stillness shoulder their weight. Down on the river, ice ground against ice, teeth against teeth. A single crack ran like a whispered warning under the snow. The hymn dropped to a murmur so the water could listen. Even the stars seemed to still their glitter. A Quaker kitchen door opened with the patience of oak. Steam from a copper kettle drifted into the cold like a soft decree. Bread, boots, and a nod made of courage changed owners. Kindness put on its winter disguise and asked for no names. Between corncrib and woodpile, a small tin whistle stitched a message through the dark. 2 short, 1 long. Wait, then move. The wind arrived like a curtain lifting. The child learned the sky faster than letters, tracing the dipper's handle toward the star that refused to wander. The star did not promise, it commanded. Feet obeyed and the lane turned itself into a shadow. A canvas-topped wagon creaked once and then became silence on wheels. Mercy replaced the clock as the only schedule that mattered. Time kept itself by the distance between safe doors. News traveled inside melodies the way heat hides in bread. A verse meant a washed-out trail. A chorus meant a patrol at the bridge. The quilt shivered on its rail and made a language of angles. Squares became river bends. Triangles became good turns. Seams became borders to respect. A dog barked twice in the far woods and then lost interest. Someone breathed out slowly and borrowed courage from the exhale. Harriet touched the child's shoulder and tilted her lantern just enough to paint a shallow bowl of light. The bowl moved with them like a portable harbor. The moon was a polished coin dropped behind cloud. What light remained belonged to frost and faith. A mill's old wheel creaked to itself 2 fields away. Harriet used the sound like a compass for distance. They crossed a ditch that smelled of iron and leaves, careful with each footfall. Snow broke with the soft sigh of paper. At a fence line, someone had left a pair of worn gloves to dry. The gloves hung like empty hands holding a place in the world. The wagon turned into a stand of trees and vanished into a geometry of trunks. Branches knitted a roof out of black lines and cold stars. Harriet paused to listen to her own pulse and the frame of the forest answering back. The night was a body that could carry them or reject them. They waited while a sleigh slid past on the distant road, bells damped with cloth. Voices rode the air like dull blades and then were gone. A henhouse rustled once and settled the way people do when they decide to be brave. Courage is a room that fits whoever steps inside. The hymn from the church climbed the hill again, thinner now but unbroken. Someone changed keys to make the melody lean forward. They reached a stretch of river where footprints ended and reeds began. The reeds kept their own counsel and did not applaud. The ice near the bank wore a film of black water. A plank lay half hidden like a sentence missing its verb. Harriet tested the plank, listening for the language of stress in the wood. The river answered in tiny vowels of sound. One by one they crossed, slow as thought. The cold pulled at their ankles as if it wanted better introductions. On the far bank, the world smelled different. Oak smoke, wet rope, the ghost of apples. Difference is sometimes the first vocabulary of safety. A door with a star cut into its upper panel stood waiting. Starlight landed on the floor and assembled itself into a quiet path. Inside, the kettle asked no questions and the stove answered all of them. Steam uncurled from cups like released fists. No one used names. Names could be stolen while you slept. Harriet watched the windows for the wrong kind of light. Fear has colors if you live with it long enough. She ate standing, counting the beats between distant sounds. Counting is a bridge that never collapses. A woman with flour on her sleeves set down a loaf and pretended not to notice the way hands trembled. Pretending can be a gift. The child blew on broth as if teaching it to cool. The spoon flashed like a small silver fish. Someone dried a pair of socks above the stove and forgot to be ashamed. Warmth is a password that works in any language. The house had its own orchestra of timbers and nails. Every note had a meaning, but only the family could translate. Before dawn they moved again, lighter by a pound of fear and heavier by a pound of hope. Hope is strange ballast. They kept to fence lines and little gullies where shadows collected. The night repaid attention with safe corners. A fox crossed their path and didn't care who they were. Indifference is a blessing when you expect a verdict. At a stile, Harriet checked the sky again and found Polaris where she had left it. The star was a loyal witness that refused to look away. A frozen puddle showed her face as a smudge and then broke it into pieces. She did not mind. The new pieces looked forward. They passed a field of corn stubble braided with snow. The stubble pointed up like 1,000 small arrows that agreed on the sky. Somewhere behind them, a door opened and shut with a sound like clasped hands. The night closed ranks and hid what it was given. A far bell rang once and let the note linger. Bells are the oldest messengers and the least curious. The child stumbled and did not cry. Silence can be a kind of mastery. Harriet adjusted the pace by half a thought, and the group found a common breath. Breathing together makes a single animal out of fear. A thin plank bridge crossed a creek that had forgotten how to speak. They crossed by, listening to the wood remember them. At the edge of a pasture, posts cast long, cautious shadows. Shadows learn manners in winter. A man stepped from a hayshed with a lantern jacketed by his hand. He wore the kind of face that is good at keeping doors closed quietly. He led them to a wagon that smelled of rope and dried apples. The smell began the work of telling them they would live. They lay under canvas, and their bodies learned the language of stillness. Stillness is grammar, mistakes can be heard. The wagon rolled, and each rut in the road translated into a new sentence. The night added punctuation in the form of wind. A patrol passed so close that conversation could have brushed them. The words meant nothing, only tone traveled, and tone was bored. The wagon slowed to let boredom get ahead. Boredom is the only ally you cannot bribe. A quilt waited at the next fence. Different pattern, same promise. Promise is a pattern that does not need to be taught twice. They waited while a cloud loosened its grip on the moon. The moon is a generous thief when properly distracted. A farmhouse window blinked twice farther on, small as a secret. Secrets prefer that size. Someone hummed a bar of the hymn to check if courage was still tuned. Courage hummed back in the same key. The ground softened with the hint of a thaw, and the wagon found new letters to write with its wheels. Every road has a dialect. They stopped in a lane lined with trees that had forgotten leaves. Forgetting can be an act of mercy. A door opened at the end like the answer to a riddle that had taken all night to tell. The answer did not speak. It steamed in bowls and warmed the air. No one cheered. Joy has its own sense of volume. The lantern on the hill blinked twice once more before going out for good. A pledge finished its sentence. Morning began to unbutton the horizon an inch at a time. The star kept its place like a thumb holding a page. Names waited in the light to become names again. Not property, not cargo. Harriet folded the night like a map she did not need to keep and faced the next crossing. The song did not end. It only changed voices. By the time the sun cleared the mill, footprints were rumors with no witnesses. The quilt was only cloth again. The wind remembered nothing, which was the point. The first half of the 19th century was a country split by statutes and stitched by footsteps. On courthouse paper, the lines looked clean. On winter roads, they bled. Freedom depended less on latitude than on who opened a back door. The Constitution baked contradiction into national law, and compromise delayed justice by design. Cotton expanded, markets hardened, and human bodies became collateral. Every boom in shipping echoed as a tightening of chains. Congress sharpened the blade in 1793 and again in 1850 with fugitive slave acts that nationalized pursuit. Free soil towns were drafted into a business of capture, and paperwork turned neighbors into deputies. A signature could send a family south faster than a river current. Southern claimants needed only affidavits to seize people accused of flight. Accused persons were denied a jury, and federal commissioners earned more for rulings that favored return. The wage of injustice was paid on delivery. Northern states pushed back with personal liberty laws and courthouse resistance, yet federal reach grew longer than town pride. Cities learned to live in the gray between legal and right. Out of that gray rose vigilance committees that fundraised, scouted, and fought cases. Churches, mutual aid groups, and black abolitionists built first response teams. A bell could call to worship or to witness. The Underground Railroad was not a corporation, but a habit of help. Its stations were kitchens and barns. Its conductors were people who memorized country lanes and sky. Secrecy kept it agile and hard to map. Networks spanned cities and farms, Philadelphia, New York, Syracuse, Cleveland, Detroit, and small towns no atlas bothered to name. Lake ports became gates to another legal world. Ferries, skiffs, and winter ice completed the last mile to Canada. Canada mattered because British law struck slavery from its ledgers by the 1830s. A new flag could mean first wages, first paper with your chosen name, first sleep without a lookout. Geography turned into jurisprudence at the shoreline. Routes wriggled to avoid magistrates, ferried patrols, and chatty taverns. A single zealous constable could kink a county's map. Flexibility, not straightness, kept people breathing. Quakers, Methodists, Baptists, and free black congregations hosted meetings where hymns doubled as logistics. Hospitality became liturgy with the stove as altar. A bowl of stew could be both supper and signal. Black leadership sat at the network's heart. Preachers, sailors, porters, midwives, and veterans who knew the price of a wrong turn. Frederick Douglass edited words that argued. Harriet Tubman carried plans that walked. Newspapers fought the day shift while lanterns handled nights. Money moved in envelopes and hat brims to buy tickets, hire wagons, and bribe at need. False bottoms in carts turned produce into hiding space. Tailors stitched pockets large enough for documents and bread. Communication adapted to whatever would not be confiscated. Knocks, lantern blinks, and window shades set at odd angles did the quiet work. A whistle pattern could stand in for a paragraph. Songs traveled faster than letters and died slower than rumors. Verses could mark a closed bridge, a friendly ferry, or a changed patrol. Metaphor became the safest plain speech. Follow the Drinking Gourd pointed eyes to the Big Dipper and then to Polaris, the star that refused to wander. Children learned that sky, like other children, learned streets. At night, the universe turned into public signage. Quilt lore lives in memory and museum labels, though scholars debate its certainty. Whether or not patterns were formal codes, families did use cloth and color to time visits, cover footprints, and hide garments. A patchwork on a fence could be laundry by noon and language by midnight. Bounty hunters worked the same towns with opposite goals. They read newspapers, watched docs, and built alliances with corrupt deputies. Hunters and helpers learned the same streets by different lights. Countermeasures kept pace with threats: aliases, forged passes, sudden detours, and court disruptions. Vigilance committees staged rescues on courthouse steps when paper failed. Crowds could be as protective as walls. Women were everywhere in the system: cooks, lookouts, midwives, letter carriers, and strategists. A baby's cry could doom a wagon, so mothers learned the clockwork of wind and wheels. Grandmothers knew which gossip traveled safest. Railroads and canals reshaped distance, and the network rode those arteries. A canal boat's manifest hid workers among barrels. A real train's timetable concealed passengers between stations. Iron and water offered indifferent cover. Winter's cruelty sometimes favored flight. Frozen rivers became bridges. Hard ground buried tracks. Dawn came late enough to buy more night. Lawyers, printers, and porters formed an odd coalition with sailors, carpenters, and maids. The cause needed every trade. A city is a toolbox if you can borrow the right hands. Paper, bills of sale, passes, writs could kill or save. Clerks who hesitated for 10 minutes sometimes changed lives. Ink has always been a weapon. The network tried to write back. In the Midwest and Northeast, black settlements grew near lakes and rivers, places like Buxton, Amherstburg, and St. Catharines. Schools, churches, and brass bands reassembled community. Liberty became practice, not just theory. Not every attempt reached morning. Betrayals happened, storms did their work, illness traveled under canvas, memory kept the names that paper never recorded. Headlines recorded famous rescues and court cases, but most trips were quiet and unsigned. House by house, the Republic fought with its better self after dark. Conscience learned to use side doors. Conductors kept notebooks in their heads. Who owed who? Which barn had a dog? Which mill squealed in a westerly? Failure meant capture. Accuracy meant sleep. Oral cartography outlived most printed maps. Church basements stored barrels beside blankets and hymnals beside ledgers. A revival meeting might be followed by a planning session. Faith and logistics shared the same bench. Public marches and petitions mattered, but private courage moved bodies. A farmer's nod, a midwife's silence, a dockhand's delay. Each was a rung and a ladder over the wall. The ladder held because thousands lent a rung. The network adapted every season as laws tightened and eyes sharpened. No central office meant no single point of failure. Decentralization was not a theory, it was survival. All along the route, children learned to read sky and adults learned to read rooms. A creak on the second stair meant wait. A kettle left just off the boil meant safe. The ordinary hid the extraordinary in plain sight. In the end, the most reliable border was the one between fear and imagination. People crossed it in song, in silence, and in company. The country remapped itself each night and pretended not to notice by day. Auction day began with the smell of molasses and iron, the kind that clings to the tongue and makes prayer feel heavy. Paper moved between hands that had never met the names on it. A boy held a rope without asking what it tied to. By noon, the yard was a market of glances and valuations. People were turned slowly, as if light could reveal a defect that love had not seen. A ledger caught every detail except the truth. The mother, Ruth, counted the breaths of her daughter, Leah, the way sailors count swells. Each number was a life raft that could not float too. Counting was something no one could confiscate. A trader folded the page that held Leah's line and tapped the margin with a fingernail. Tapping was how men rehearsed ownership. No one applauded. The hammer came down with the force of a weather change. The sound did not end. It kept echoing through the ribs of the crowd like a bell that refused to die. Echoes know their way around bone. Ruth fixed her eyes on a nailhead in the fence post and did not blink. If you do not look up, you cannot be separated by sight. The nail allowed this small geometry of survival. A foreman gestured the girl toward a wagon with a canvas lip and no shadow underneath. Wagons are mouths that do not chew where people can see. Leah climbed into the wordless part of the day. A hand wrapped in kid leather moved her along with a softness that rang louder than cruelty. Kindness used wrong becomes another lock. Keys are not the only tools that close things. Ruth's brother, Josiah, stood near the pump with his shoulders tucked into themselves as if hiding their address. He had carried flour, timber, and secrets through worse weather than this. None of those weights had trained him for the one about to fall. The auctioneer wiped sweat from his lip and named a number meant to erase the contours of a child's face. Numbers have no eyes and so miss everything important. The crowd adjusted its attention like a flock of indifferent birds. Paper changed hands and something invisible left Ruth's body with it. A person can feel the weight of a signature across a yard. Paper is a wind when the rules say you must stand still. After, the yard fed on the ordinary. A dog shook, a man asked for water, the pump coughed iron and relief. The sinful part of grief is how the world declines to pause. Clocks go on, trusting themselves. That evening, the church on the rise filled with the scrape of benches and the damp of nightclothes. No one announced the agenda. Grief did that work. A lantern on the windowsill blinked once and then stayed steady as if the room had chosen not to lie. The deacon began with a psalm and left long spaces inside the lines. Spaces are where courage breathes. People filled them with a murmur that did not need leadership. Josiah sat at the back and studied the grain of the floorboards. Wood remembers weight. He begged it to forget. Forgetting is an uphill craft. Ruth listened without hearing until the hymn found a key that matched her pulse. The human heart will tune itself to the closest song. That is why armies fear music. They did not speak the girl's name. Names invite the wrong ears. Instead, they counted the miles to the river and the farms whose kettles steamed late. Counting is a language that does not blush. An elder woman, Alma, set a quilt across 2 chairs and smoothed it like a map. Her fingers paused on triangles as if they were verbs. Language can be sewn when paper is dangerous. A young man with a tin whistle tested a pattern against the rafters, 2 short, 1 long, and watched the room nod without looking at him. Sound is a road that leaves fewer prints than feet. The rafters kept the secret like good citizens. Someone asked whether the law saw through quilts and whistles. The law is a man, not a star, Alma said. Men tire, stars do not. That line settled in the room like warm bread. When people are fed, they can travel farther inside the same night. Ruth let the sentence lift her chin. Decision arrived quietly, wrapped in logistics. There would be a wagon at the far lane after moonrise, a kitchen door on its latch, a rooster that would not testify. Each promise wore a plain coat. The hymn they chose had an extra verse no book sold. In it, the Drinking Gourd pointed to a specific ferry and the river bent to a particular mill race that froze early. Metaphor was a locksmith. Josiah stood and spoke as if asking the floor for permission. He would not let the night take Ruth without a second name to carry the other end. He had never been brave before. He was merely out of alternatives. The congregation did not cheer. They changed the arrangement of chairs. Furniture is how meetings vote. The aisle widened into a path. Ruth tied her headscarf twice and tucked a scrap of thread into the knot. The thread matched Leah's sewn hem from last month. Faith often wears the shape of small superstitions. Outside, night arranged the farm into silhouettes, the way a conductor arranges sections before a performance. Barns became low cellos, trees became violas, gates waited like muted brass. The wind tuned the dark. A boy trotted ahead to test the road for fresh tracks and returned with only his breath to report. Breath is the best kind of reconnaissance. It fogs and vanishes. No file keeps it. The first door opened on the back latch and breathed stew into the lane. The smell rearranged Ruth's insides long enough for her to walk again. Hunger is an excellent negotiator with despair. A farmer's wife pressed boots into Ruth's hands and kept talking about potatoes and weather. Conversation is the breakwater of panic. Panic knows when it is being fenced. They moved under a moon the color of pewter, too thin to brag. Thin light teaches careful feet. Care makes fewer mistakes than speed. At the next yard, a rope hung from a branch with 2 knots, 1 for wait, 2 for go. Knots remember fingers when mouths must not remember words. Ruth touched the rope as if it were an altar rail. A dog lifted its head and decided against caring. Indifference is the pet most households can afford. Josiah walked as if he could be taught to deserve it. They paused where the lane met a narrow creek that sounded like a rumor. A plank bridged the talk from one bank to another. Josiah tested it with the handle of a rake and felt honesty in the wood. Halfway across, Ruth heard the night change shape. A sleigh bell spoke from the road behind them, the note damped, yet lively enough to write worry on the air. She counted to 6, then to 8, and found she had enough numbers. A Quaker couple waited in a doorway that had forgotten how to close with a slam. Their faces were made of the kind of patience that has decided it would rather do a job than be praised for it. Some virtues work best in work clothes. Inside, the kettle sang the pitch of returned blood. Steam rose from cups and made ghosts of their faces. Ghosts have seen worse and said nothing. Josiah scanned the shelf for tools that could become excuses. Twine, a chipped ladle, a sack needing a knot. Excuses are bandages the night accepts as medical. He chose the twine. The Quaker man set bread by the stove and said, "No names here. North has no use for them yet." His wife added, "Rest is the first mile." Rest can be as tactical as any detour. Ruth warmed her hands and let her eyes fall shut to check whether they still worked when closed. Vision is not the only sense that measures danger. The body keeps a second ledger. The congregation had decided earlier that the hymn would move with them. Someone took the porch and hummed into the dark like a lighthouse. Light can be made of sound if you need it to be. When they stepped out, the hymn stretched into a road sign. 2 houses answered with a single lamp blink each. Blink is a dialect only the wind translates quickly. Word of patrols moved like weather in the low fields, a gust against the hedges, a hush along the ditch. They listen the way surgeons listen for silence to confirm a heartbeat. Confirmation bias can save lives if it chooses your side. At a split in the fence lines, a scarf hung on a post with the tassel wound twice. The knot meant take the longer left, not the shorter right. The longer left had a friendly mill. The shorter right had a recently talkative innkeeper. They slid along a hedgerow and found a wagon with a canvas that sagged like tired cloud. The driver used the voice of a man discussing seed prices. Seed talk creates an all-weather alibi. Under the canvas, the world shrank to breath and wool. Human beings can live inside the space between two heartbeats if they practice. Practice was mandatory tonight. On the road, a patrol's lantern wrote a narrow grammar into the ditch. The wagon answered with punctuation that sounded like axle complaints and horse breath. Grammar passed inspection. When the wagon stopped for the first time, it stopped beside a fieldstone wall that kept nothing out but impatience. The driver spoke to no one about weather patterns that justified a halt. Weather is the friend that says yes when lies need company. A kitchen window ahead bloomed once and went dark. That was enough for the driver to resume. Sometimes signals are better as rumors than as announcements. They passed a mill that groaned when the wind turned westerly. Harriet had told them to count 2 groans for the bridge, 3 for the bend. The mill behaved like a teacher proud to be predictable. Ruth reached for the scrap of thread at her scarf and felt, for a glazed instant, the hem of Leah's dress. Memory can be a weapon if handled by the right hand. She put the weapon away without laying it down. They reached a church whose bell rope had been knotted to silence. Inside, the pews held blankets, and the pulpit held a ledger that did not know the names it saved. Pulpits have endured worse contradictions. The deacon had left biscuits wrapped in paper and a verse under a candlestick. The verse bent the melody toward a ferry schedule without admitting it. Paper can be art when it must not be evidence. A child sleeping on a bench turned in a dream and almost said a name. Ruth touched the air above the mouth as if pressing a seal into wax. Wax holds better when the hand is gentle. The whistle pattern, 2 short, 1 long, stitched the night again, this time from behind the woodshed. Its thread pulled them to a door without hinges that squealed. Squeals can be drowned if the wind cooperates. They crossed a pasture by counting fence posts, every 6th post a low crouch, every 12th a pause. Mathematics is democracy at midnight, fair, unglamorous, reliable. Ruth trusted it because it did not care who she was. At the river they found the planks set from bank to hummock and from hummock to ice. The ice made a sound like teeth thinking things over. Thinking made no difference, they crossed anyway. Halfway, a shout peeled off the far road, uncertain, then certain, then swallowed by its own echo. The wagon's driver muttered a farmer's prayer that sounded like inventory. Inventory pleases angels and juries. On the opposite bank, a lantern hooded by a hand bobbed twice. The ferry was a skiff with a conscience and an oar. Consciences tire, oars do not. They climbed in and made of their bodies a balance problem the river could solve. The ferryman kept the oar quiet and let the current do the hard arithmetic. Currents have always been freelance abolitionists. When they bumped the far reeds, they did not thank the river aloud. Gratitude is a light you place inside your chest and carry forward. The chest is waterproof if you keep moving. The next house was a square frame with a star-shaped cutout in the door. Starlight printed itself on the floor and pointed toward a bench. The bench had a blanket that remembered other backs. Inside, a woman with flour on her wrists answered questions no one asked by pouring tea. Her silence made a shape for safety to sit in. Safety prefers chairs to speeches. Josiah stood near the stove and let the heat lift the lie that he was not shaking. Shaking is honest work. The body files it under maintenance. He folded his hands to give them employment. Ruth opened her palm to find a corn kernel that had traveled with her, a stowaway from the yard of sale. She rolled it between fingers like a prayer bead for a faith she had not chosen. Choice is often what remains after obedience fails. They slept in segments the way soldiers do when a ceasefire is a rumor. Rumors can be blankets if you pull them up far enough. Sleep taught their hearts to clap in time. Before dawn, the church sent its hymn down the lane again, thinner and braver. The last verse stepped around a new rumor of patrols. Songs are good at detours. At first light, the Quaker man pressed a folded paper into Josiah's hand, an address in a town that had learned to keep good secrets. The letters were plain as fence posts. Plain is a camouflage that does not age. The woman pressed a child's cap into Ruth's palm, not because Ruth needed it, but because someone else would. Gifts travel faster than plans. Plans eventually catch up. They left by a different gate so the path could heal behind them. Paths have skins that scar beautifully when given time. Time is the most expensive doctor. By the time the sun found the river's silver spine, the night had already told the next family where to begin. Inciting incidents do not stop. They queue. The queue bends toward those who will sing. Morning made promises the road could not keep. Frost softened into mud and began telling stories about wheels and shoes. Stories attract listeners who should be elsewhere. A rider showed at the far fence with a scarf the color of debt. His horse breathed news into the hedgerow. News grew legs. The driver lifted a hand that meant stall. Stalling is a craft that looks like patience from a distance. Up close, it is mathematics. He set the wagon brake and began repairing nothing in particular. Nothing takes longer than a nut already tight. The performance bought 5 safe minutes. Ruth kept her eyes on a chip in the wagon's sideboard. Attention is a bandage you can apply anywhere. It stops a kind of bleeding. Josiah tested the weight of silence in his mouth and found it serviceable. Silence can be shaped into answers if you soften it first. He tried a smile with no opinions. The rider asked about Seed and Frost and whether anyone had seen a pair passing through with a child. The question wore the right boots and the wrong voice. Voice betrays intention long before words do. The driver shrugged toward the cloud line and complained about the price of nails. Nails are a universal currency for men who need to be unhelpful together. The rider could not spend it. He checked the wagon canvas with the eyes of a man who knows what bodies weigh. Canvas answered with a sag that had practiced lying in winter. Practice is often indistinguishable from truth. The rider moved on, not convinced, not free to linger. Duty is a leash that chafes every neck it touches. His horse's ears argued both sides. When the lane cleared, the driver changed nothing about his posture. Nothing is a signal if you teach it to be. He whispered, "Creek Road," and the wagon obeyed. At the crossroads, the standard left turn wore a new crown of hoofprints. Fresh traffic advertising kills. They took the right fork into a corridor of poplars that remembered storms. Trees are good at keeping confidences because they have no errands. The road narrowed into discretion. A quilt on a fence ahead announced triangles where squares should have been. The pattern was wrong on purpose. Wrong is a hinge that swings both ways. Alma had taught them what to do when a signal felt counterfeit. You answer with delay, not panic. Delay costs less blood. The wagon rolled 10 yards, paused, and rolled 12 more. A watcher with a notebook will miscount one of those numbers. The rest of the math will break by itself. Behind them, hoofbeats made a decision. Decisions crow. The driver let the wagon drift toward an orchard already emptied by winter. Between rows, the air held its breath. Branches laced against the pale sky like finer bars than any jailer could afford. The group learned to be smaller. They left the road and let branches write scratches on the canvas as alibis. Scratches say, "We belong to trees." Trees corroborate without leaving the porch. The rider doubled back to the fork and chose the popular lie. Popularity is a narcotic that comforts bad logic. Dust rose where he preferred it. At the orchard's end, a stile by a low stone wall offered a choice that did not look like one. Left went to the ferry everyone used, right went to a mill race that sometimes changed its mind. They chose the mill race and pretended they hadn't. Harriet had rejoined on foot. Her scarf rhymed with breath. She moved with the forward tilt of someone who has previously survived the next mile. Survival teaches posture. She tapped the wagon bed twice and then held up 3 fingers. 2 meant stop. 3 meant we will become 3 smaller things. Big targets are a courtesy to hunters. They split, wagon to the mill track, Ruth and Josiah into the hedgerow, Harriet cutting a diagonal to check for watchers. Splitting multiplies both risk and options. Options are the only wealth the night accepts. The mill stream sulked under a scum of ice and last year's leaves. Sulking water makes a different kind of quiet. Ruth learned it fast. A rope stretched under the footbridge like an unspoken thought. Thought becomes plan when hands touch it. Josiah touched once and felt the plan flex. On the far bank, a boy stood with a basket of potatoes and an outrageously dull expression. Dullness is heavy armor if you wear it well. He raised one potato in greeting and lowered it as if the air had answered. He walked away whistling the wrong pattern. 3 short, 1 long. Wrong is right when you're jamming. Eavesdroppers take notes they should throw away. A second rider appeared beyond the mill with a deputy on foot trying to be taller than his shoes. The deputy made a rectangle of paper hold the shape of a warrant. Warrants pretend to own whoever reads them. Harriet crossed the stream where the ice knew her name. Knowledge is a bridge that nobody warns you about. She stepped onto the bank and did not apologize for existing. The deputy hailed and pointed at Ruth and Josiah's direction. Pointing is a confession if the wind is listening. The wind took it down. Harriet called back something about a broken sluice and a sick cow. Cows do more work in excuses than in barns. The deputy preferred the cow to the people. While men discussed water, the wagon rolled a harmless distance and became a pile of farm chores. Chores are camouflage for those who wear fatigue honestly. Fatigue will testify for anyone. Ruth and Josiah moved fence post to fence post with the humility of tall grass. Humility is what gets done when fear has no voice. They reached the shadow of a hayrick and became its opinion. The riders finally moved on, trailing suspicion like thread from a pocket. Thread catches on every nail it meets. The pocket will come apart at the wrong time. Harriet led the pair through a copse where stumps sat like failed arguments. Arguments lose interest when nobody contradicts them. They bled into the next field. At a farmhouse with a sagging porch, a stovepipe breathed like an animal asleep. The porchboard third from the end announced a wait with a high, soft cry. Houses sing to those who listen. A woman opened the door with a look that measured need against capacity. Capacity is a room that expands under pressure if the framing was done right. She enlarged the doorway with her shoulders. They were fed with spoons big enough to count as strategy. Strategy is calories that decided to be brave. The woman talked about weather patterns and kept the nouns neutral. From the back room, a man brought a sack and a ledger that recorded debts of a different economy. Ledger lines can hold promises if you write with a blunt pencil. He wrote a time and a ferry name by not writing it. The plan required a decoy at the common ferry to draw attention. Decoys are cousins of courage who never had a legal name. A pair of church boys volunteered to carry empty baskets conspicuously. They went first, shambling with the exaggerated guilt of children who have nothing to hide. Guilt is a prop as much as a feeling. No one bought the baskets, everyone watched them anyway. The real path bent into a low lane where frost kept secrets better than soil. Secrets prefer hard ground. Footprints got stingy. At the lane's mouth, someone had chalked a fish sideways on a gatepost. Sideways fish meant ferry closed, bridge watchful. Symbols evolve faster than patrol schedules. They detoured to a smithy, whose anvil tapped a code into the morning. 3, pause, 2, pause, long. It translated to 2 riders 10 minutes behind, and dog that bites truth and lies equally. Dogs like fairness on their own terms. The smith's apprentice slipped Ruth a rag that hid a scrap of paper. Paper wore a hat of grease and a coat of soot. It would travel unnoticed among 1,000 honest rags. The scrap named a skiff moored behind a boathouse with a door that never learned to close. Names are fragile, skiffs are stubborn. Stubborn things make better allies than famous ones. They reached the boathouse by walking as if they had always known where it was. Pretend long enough and the road believes you. The door accepted their argument. Inside, the skiff smelled of pitch and rescue. Oars lay like good advice. Harriet set the stroke rate with the kind of authority that forgives errors as long as they are symmetrical. Halfway across, a call came thin over the water. Someone friendly using a name that wasn't. Friendly is a shape thieves can borrow, Harriet answered with noise like an oar-nick. On the far reeds, a lantern lifted and fell twice. Twice is a word that doesn't enjoy company. They cut a different line through the weeds. They hauled the skiff into a cradle of cattails and covered it with a quilt that had never wanted this job. Want is a luxury the network cannot afford. Duty wore patterns today. The path to the next house threaded a ditch and a line of hives asleep for winter. Bees don't testify out of season. The ditch rode cold along their ankles. A patrol's dog found the ditch and changed its mind after 2 sniffs. Cold edits ambition. The handler swore at physics. They reached a red barn with a hayloft window shaped like a question. The question was, how many can the night carry? But the night refused to answer badly. Refusal is a kind of fidelity. Inside, the loft had false flooring built by someone who trusted wood more than people. Trust wood. It does not read newspapers. They lay in the cavity and let hay argue with their lungs. Below, Boots rehearsed authority on the barn's throat. The farmer made the usual promises about pigs and chores and the right to be uninteresting. Uninteresting is the passport every citizen should carry. A deputy poked Hay with a fork and found the limits of superstition. Hay resisted interrogation by being everywhere. The fork learned humility. When the patrol left, it took the air with it and left silence to repay the debt. Silence pays slowly. They waited until patience raised interest. The farmer's wife climbed the ladder with a tin plate of biscuits and a statement in the form of a stare. Stares warn and bless simultaneously. She did both. Harriet revised the plan without calling it that. Plans forgive revisions if you keep the rhythm. Rhythm keeps people from arguing with fear. They would skip the town with the friendly paper because friendly paper can be subpoenaed. Subpoenas enjoy friendly things. They would aim instead for a church whose bell rope had learned new knots. The church's windows looked like eyes that had read too much and slept too little. Reading is a dangerous comfort. Sleep negotiates bad dreams better than logic. A boy in the yard bounced a ball against the wall 3 times, then twice, then once. Bounce patterns are lingua franca when stars are at lunch. Harriet nodded and followed the arithmetic. Inside, a woman tuned a pump organ and did not turn her head. Music protects by occupying all the reasons to speak. She held the cord until the room decided to breathe. They took blankets and advice disguised as gossip. Gossip travels because it tastes like dessert. Advice travels best when smuggled inside it. Back on the lane, the wind shifted and delivered the smell of wet leather and expensive urgency. Hunters had borrowed a mood from town. The mood scuffed the road where it passed. Harriet shortened the stride and deepened the silence. Groups only move at the speed of their slowest decision. She made decisions for them until they could make their own. They slid behind a stone mausoleum in a churchyard where names worked the graveyard shift. Memory has a union and good benefits. The union kept them hidden. 2 riders trotted past, annoyed at the absence of narrative. Hunters hate when the story refuses to introduce itself. The story remained rude. At dusk, they reached a farm whose lantern language included sarcasm. Sarcasm is the province of the brave. The lantern blinked once as if to say, finally. The family there had prepared 3 disguises, a peddler's pack, a widow's veil, and a cart of broken chairs that could be mended forever. Forever is cover if you lean into it. Harriet assigned roles like a stage manager with weather in mind. Ruth put on the veil and discovered that invisibility is a skill you must practice. Practice began immediately. Josiah became the kind of man who knocks on doors about chair legs. They trundled into town at full humility. Towns respect humility the way cats respect furniture. They rub against it and move on. At the square, a constable asked about licenses with the curiosity of a lemon. Curiosity can be sour and still legal. Josiah discussed chair joints until the man's attention needed ointment. The decoy boys reappeared untended and cheerfully obvious with their empty baskets. Obvious is volatile. It draws and dissipates in equal measure. The crowd turned its head away from the cart that mattered. By night's edge, they were past the last tavern and back under the grammar of hedgerows. Grammar is kinder in the country. It uses shorter sentences. They reached a bridge rumored to have a listener under it. Listeners multiply at choke points. Harriet switched to the silence that means walk like fog. On the far side, a field sloped to a line of beeches whose roots held the hill together like friendship. Friendship is infrastructure. It never gets funding, but it keeps things standing. A lantern blinked twice from a porch no one was looking at. You see signals when you grow worthy of them. Worthiness is taught by need. The porch belonged to a woman who ran a boarding house for the officially uninteresting. She made tea and decrees with equal competence. Decrees included beds and curfews. Upstairs, Ruth lay on a ticking that held more straw than comfort and let her mind circle the image of Leah like a hawk studying a lost field. Grief patrols its old borders. Patrols find no one to arrest. Josiah sat on the floor and pulled twine between his hands until it learned not to remember the auction yard. Twine forgets quickly with encouragement. He spoke to it as if to a child. Harriet stood guard at the window and watched the town unspool its evening rituals. Rituals make people visible even when they are alone. She counted lamps like beads. When the boarding house slept, a knock came in a pattern that sounded like an argument resolving. Arguments that resolve are rare and to be cherished. She answered with a scrape of chair leg. A courier entered with a note that had traveled tucked inside a hymn book. Hymn books have diplomatic immunity. The note said the ferry east was watched and the northern ford high but doable by dawn. They chose the ford because watchers prefer dry feet. Preference makes patterns. Patterns are maps. Dawn would write them a bridge out of cold light. The boarding house keeper gave Ruth a child's cap like the one offered earlier, as if the world insisted on insisting. Insistence is a kind of kindness that refuses to embarrass itself. Ruth took it and learned to carry two kinds of weight. They left before first cockcrow, moving on the seam between night and day where silhouettes look undecided. Indecision is an asset at distances greater than 20 yards. The seam stitched them forward. At the ford, the river's voice sounded tired but cooperative. Tired rivers are honest. They show their stones. They crossed in a slow braid. Bodies leaned into a geometry that kept balance in the conversation. Geometry is generous when asked politely. The far bank accepted their apology for existing. Behind them, town woke, and the first story of the morning began to circulate about a peddler with chair legs and a widow too young for such black. Stories travel faster than any horse when given a running start. This one ran in the wrong direction. By full dawn, they were 3 miles farther into anonymity. Anonymity is a province with no capital but many citizens. They paid taxes in attention and received services in rumors. The chase did not end. It became background weather. Weather still kills, but only if you forget to look up. They looked up often and found Polaris doing its old job without complaint. They moved as one animal now, breathing in the same tents, hearing the same music of hinges and creaks. A group's body learns itself. Learning is the only speed that matters. They would need new signals by tomorrow because hunters had learned half of today's. Learning is contagious on both sides. Innovation is not a hobby here, it is a meal. They camped in a copse where leaves wrote thin script against the sky. Script can be read by those who hunger for it. They were almost fluent. Night rose again and laid its hand over the ledger of the day. The ledger balanced. They were still on the right side of the page. Night restarted the world with a squeak of frost over dirt. Breath turned to thread, then to lace. The road unrolled like ribbon cut from iron. Clouds marched in ranks that tried to hide the sky. Gaps opened like eyelids and shut again. The stars blinked acknowledgments in code. Harriet watched for the narrowest windows and counted the beats between breaks. Timing is a bridge you carry inside your chest. She walked at the pace of numbers that refused to lie. The wagon had been traded for boots and silence. Footsteps learned to be forgettable. Snow helped and then betrayed in equal measure. Josiah wrapped twine around his palms until courage fit better. He practiced steady by naming fence posts as saints. Saints forgive extra footsteps. Ruth held the child's cap in her coat pocket and let it warm by proximity to pulse. Heat is a theology that does not debate. Proximity turns memory into fuel. A wind came low from the west with the smell of iron and old apples. West winds carry stubbornness without apology. They make small people taller. The lane narrowed into a throat and then opened on a field of stubble silvered by hoarfrost. Hoarfrost turns poverty into spectacle. The field accepted their weight like a signed agreement. Ahead, a ridgeline made of beeches held up a slice of sky the color of pewter. Pewter skies ask for patience instead of faith. Patience lives longer. Harriet raised her hand and drew an invisible seam from horizon to horizon. Seam means keep to this thread when vision fails. The group became needle and cloth. Clouds closed the lid and made them navigate by earth alone. Earth knows north by ditch and stone. Stones remember directions better than most people. They found the old Roman compass of the countryside. Hedge, ditch, lane, and wall. The grammar never changes. You decline nouns with your feet. A creek cut the field into two versions of cold. Water negotiated with ice and lost politely. They followed the courtesy downstream. Where the creek met willow roots, the surface thickened like glass given advice. Advice can be wrong and still helpful. Harriet probed with a rake handle and listened to the wood's opinion. The wood agreed to a crossing if they behaved like whispers. Whispers have good posture. They distributed weight like a benediction. Halfway across, a jet of air rose under the crack and painted their faces with warning. Warning tastes like pennies in winter. The group swallowed and finished the sentence anyway. On the far bank, a gap in the clouds slid, and the dipper peered through like a thief with ethics. Ethics, when borrowed by weather, are a gift. Polaris held steady and accepted their apology for doubting. They corrected 2 degrees east with the casual courage of those who trust practice. Practice is the best liar to fear. Fear nodded and stepped aside. A barn crouched on the next rise with shoulders hunched against jurisdiction. Jurisdiction makes buildings old. Wind only makes them honest. The doors were the color of arguments that had been settled. Inside, Hay had remembered summer on behalf of everyone else. The smell counseled survival in complete sentences. They obeyed without questions. Harriet shook snow from her scarf and reviewed the next stretch like a captain reading shoals. She needed a frozen ford and an inattentive moon. The moon obliged with modesty. Ruth warmed her hands over a lantern that wore a glove of tin. Tin radiates kindness like a shy singer. Heat walked back into her fingers and asked to stay. Josiah opened his palm and found the ghost of rope burned from auction day. Ghosts volunteer, uninvited. He let this one do some lifting. They ate bread that had memorized hands. Chewing reset the body's arithmetic. Arithmetic is hope masquerading as nutrition. Outside, wolves practiced philosophy at a distance. Philosophy has teeth when hungry. Their argument stayed theoretical. They moved again when the wind agreed to erase them. Erasure is artistry if you time it right. The field consented. Cloud refastened its buttons and closed the sky entirely. The world contract shrank to 6 feet in the next breath. 6 feet is enough when you've rehearsed. Harriet changed the order, Josiah lead, Ruth center, she rear, so the road would hear a new story underfoot. Roads grow suspicious of patterns. She fed it a new plot. The ditch at their right glittered with cat ice and opinions. Opinions break if you step on them. They stayed with facts. A farmhouse far off tried a single window as a question. The question asked who and why and how many. Harriet's quiet answered no one and whether and none. They skirted a thicket of hawthorn that had collected every rumor the wind had carried this week. Rumors stick where thorn agrees. They took the long side and let the rumors keep sharpening. By midnight, they reached a ridge whose crown carried spruce like a row of stitched dark. Dark can be sewn into shelter. The seam held. The descent offered choices disguised as mistakes. The short way promised speed and thin ice. The long way promised ache and dawn. They took the ache that could be scheduled. Ruth's breath came in music and math. She counted in measures of 20 and made hymns out of integers. Integers do not gossip. Josiah's boots learned the speech of squeak, hush, squeak. Language is easier when you accept its accent. He sounded local by the end of the hill. In the hollow, the river sprawled like a sleeping doctrine. Doctrines argue worst with spring. Winter flatters them. Tonight it offered a span of iron-colored ice, stitched with a lecturer's confidence. Harriet walked the edge with insults prepared for the ice in case flattery failed. Ice likes a negotiator who can switch tones. She carried both sermons and curses in her pocket. The first test step spoke nothing, which is the correct reply. Silence is the oath of frozen water. She made a second step and then called the others. They spaced themselves the way letters become a word you can read from across a room. Distance protected meaning. Togetherness protected courage. Halfway, the river objected with a sound like books closing. Books insist on spine. They respected it and slowed. The sky opened one lid and let Polaris wink its single permission. They adjusted course to avoid a pressure ridge that read as sarcasm. Sarcasm kills when misread. Ruth felt the child's cap through coat and cloth and told it a story she would tell again. Stories cure tremors while they last. She promised a chapter with laughter and kitchens. Josiah scanned upstream and saw nothing but the idea of pursuit. Ideas can shout as loud as hoofbeats. He chose not to translate. They reached the far snow as if stepping from scripture back to rumor. Rumor is easier to survive. It doesn't insist on footnotes. A line of poplars led them to a weir where water talked under boards. The talk was foreign but polite. They did not interrupt. Beyond stood a mill whose wheel had learned winter's grammar. No declensions, only pauses. Pause is a holy word when tired. They held it in their mouths before moving on. 2 lanterns bobbed on the road above like punctuation marks seeking a sentence. Punctuation can be friendly or fatal. Harriet decided these were commas, not periods. She guided them behind a cordwood stack and turned the group into neat shadows. Neatness prevents suspicion from finding purchase. The lanterns passed, discussing taxes and a dog with opinions. When they stepped out, the cold broke small and crystalline underfoot. Breaking is sometimes entrance music. They bowed and continued. Snow thickened until the road tasted like blank paper. Blank paper frightens writers and hunters alike. Both prefer a prompt. Harriet said a cadence counted on the left foot. Left keeps secrets better. The right foot never needed to know. They passed a gatepost chalked with a sideways fish and a small cross. Sideways meant the ferry slept. Cross meant pray for ice and walk softly. They answered with care instead of prayer. At a hedgerow, a jar hung by a string like a trapped bell. Inside, a stub of candle waited for a match that no one would risk. Waiting is a skill you can hand down. They took the field path because fields have fewer informants than roads. Informants need neighbors. Snow disapproves of crowds. Cloud thinned enough to consult the heavens again, and the dipper obliged, ladle raised like a toast you keep to yourself. They drank with their eyes. The star poured permission. A lake slept beyond the pines, unblinking. Lakes forget faster than rivers. They leave fewer witnesses. Crossing a lake is arguing with distance in its native tongue. You must talk slow and listen for grammar. Harriet spoke with the authority of ankles that had outlived worse. She sent Josiah 5 paces ahead as scout and kept Ruth 2 paces behind as anchor. Anchor wears another name for mother. The lake accepted both roles without pride. Halfway, the wind tried to push them into confessions. Confessions are exhausting. They continued with denials. Denials taste like iron and keep people vertical. Cracks threaded like hairlines in China, delicate and everywhere. China breaks where emotion insists. They replaced emotion with arithmetic and distributed weight again. Polaris drifted in and out of cloud like a physician doing rounds. The physician approved each adjustment with silence. Approval traveled well. On the far side, a stand of white birch applauded with paper hands. Birch are always literary. They kept the plot moving. They paused under a shelf of snow shaped like a roof. Roofs are oaths made of angles. They renewed promises without speeches. Ruth's teeth began knocking like an urgent visitor. She answered by humming low through her throat to make the bones feel busy. Busy bones argue less. Harriet rubbed Ruth's hands with snow to sting warmth awake. Pain is an emissary with useful papers. It stamped Ruth's palms and moved on. Josiah passed around a heel of bread that had learned patience. Patience crumbles neatly when shared. Their breath made a fog that negotiated. Clouds broke clean at last and the sky bared its atlas. Constellations looked like agreements signed by light. Harriet traced a migration with her gaze and recalibrated. They aimed for a copse whose outline matched a sketch she carried in memory. Memory is a cartographer that works for food. It had eaten well over the years. Between copse and fence, a shallow gully wrote italics into the snow. Italics emphasize without changing the word. They moved with emphasis. A lantern flared and hid again at a farmhouse that had practiced discretion for 3 generations. Practice survives inheritance taxes. The door did its job without committee. Inside, the kitchen wore a coat of steam and the furniture knew not to ask questions. Questions chill soup. The soup kept its warmth. A woman with sleeves rolled to the elbows checked fingers for frostbite and egos for swelling. Both can be massaged back into reason. She worked quickly and called it ordinary. She spread a quilt that had earned its patterns. Triangles partnered with squares like strategies that had learned to be polite. Ruth watched fabric become grammar again. Josiah extracted a splinter with dignity and the help of a pin. Dignity appreciates being useful. He breathed like a man relearning music. Harriet walked the margin of the room as if it were a map's edge. Edges contain more truth than centers. She checked the windows for colors she didn't like. The woman set boots by the stove in a row that meant morning would happen. Rows prevent arguments among shoes. Morning honors such negotiations. They slept in turns with an old dog as the official skeptic. Skeptics guard miracles from rust and from stories growing too proud. The dog declined comment and approved outcomes. Before dawn, the woman placed buttons and bread in Ruth's palm. Buttons and bread are currency at Borders. Ruth closed her hand over both economies. Outside, the world had traded black for indigo. Indigo forgives footprints before they are made. They stepped into forgiveness and tried not to waste it. Harriet recalculated the last leg to the lakeport where law changed accent. Accents confuse warrants. The plan thickened like gravy. They crossed a canal whose ice sang alto. Sopranos are for spring. Winter prefers chest voice. At the edge of town, chimneys began their morning essays. The thesis was, "We are alive and we are busy." Footnotes would be written later. A bell tolled without drama from an Anglican steeple and made no demands. Not all bells are bosses. Some just keep better time than humans. The quay wore its frost like armor, polished for inspection. Ships slept with their ropes in proper dreams. A skiff waited under planks that pretended not to know it. A man with mittens and a face like geography nodded them into an angle of shadow. Geography has no enemies, only features. He was good at features. They boarded in a choreography of silence that would have impressed saints and pickpockets. Silence earns applause only from those who need it most. The river gave a small, approving shrug. Ice floes slid by like arguments surrendered. Surrender can be strategic. They let the current do math. Mid-channel, the clouds opened for a last benediction. Polaris held court without words. The verdict was forward. They touched the far bank where flags argued politely over jurisdiction. Jurisdiction dropped its voice. Harriet took attendance by counting breath. Ruth stepped onto snow that felt translated. Translation makes the same meaning fit a new mouth. Her knees tried to remember a different kind of prayer. Josiah looked back once and saw only distances behaving themselves. Distances are best when they mind their manners. He gave them privacy. They moved into a town that had learned to be fluent in discretion. Discretion is civic. It collects no parades and pays in quiet. At a modest door with a star cutout, a hand lifted the latch from the other side. Latches have politics aligned with mercy. The door changed the weather of the room they entered. Inside waited paper that spelled wages and names without insult. Ink behaved. Chairs sat like invitations instead of interrogations. They were not finished with winter, but winter was finished with their fear. Fear, when unemployed, tends to leave town. It did not ask for a letter of recommendation. Harriet stood a moment longer in the doorway and listened for the remainder of night. Night had already gone to work elsewhere. She let it. Ruth unfolded the child's cap and set it by the stove where steam made halos. Halos are permitted indoors on cold days. She smiled like a person whose mouth remembered the shape. Josiah tied the twine into a loop and hung it on a nail. Loop store lessons. The nail approved. They had taken the long way and bought a dawn they could afford. Affordability in this region is measured in songs and miles. They paid the final coin by sleeping without names. Harriet kept rules the way sailors keep knives, close, sharp, and ready to use or discard. Rule 1 was rhythm. A group survives by breathing in the same tense. Rule 2 was names. Carry none you cannot afford to lose. She walked the edges of alleys and fields as if the world had seams that only patient hands could find. Seams forgive mistakes better than open ground. Patience buys refunds from fate. At the port of almost safety, a row of warehouses practiced anonymity. Anonymous buildings host elaborate conversations for those who listen. Harriet read the loading doors like pages in a ledger. She chose the door with the hinge that confessed at the right pitch. Confessions are useful when they repeat on cue. She made a note of the tune in her bones. Inside, a stevedore who owed no one, and everyone glanced once at Harriet's scarf and decided to remember nothing. Decision is the highest courtesy in this business. He lifted a crate because logic required a gesture. Harriet's playbook began with subtraction. Subtract attention, footprints, options you cannot maintain. What remains is survivable. She swapped the group's silhouettes the way a card sharp rearranges a hand. Tall in back becomes porter, strong in front becomes limping uncle, center becomes luggage that sighs softly. Luggage has never testified convincingly. Her ethics were simple. No child left, no story told that could not be disowned, no favor owed that could not be repaid with distance. Distance is currency with low inflation. She kept it in circulation. Signals tightened as watchers multiplied. Lantern blinks became door jamb chalk. Door jamb chalk became cough patterns. Cough patterns folded into hymn notes. Everything rehearsed, nothing repeated. A printer's shop 2 streets off ran its press late with sermons and receipts. Presses make noise that forgives discreet arrivals. Ink is a herd animal. It hides better in crowds. The printer's wife passed a bundle across a counter like a parcel of tracts. Tracts can save a soul or a night. This one saved boots and a hat that changed a face. Josiah learned a limp that answered questions before they arrived. Questions hate redundancy. The limp did its job with quiet competence. Ruth took the widow's veil again and found she could vanish in a street where pity outranked curiosity. Pity keeps its eyes tidy. Curiosity wanders off to buy apples. Harriet split the group for the last time at a crossroads of alleys, smoke and sermon bells. Splitting is multiplication in crisis and division in calm. She solved for crisis. Alma's quilt had traveled ahead to a meeting house where benches doubled as pallets and a pulpit doubled as a desk. Multi-purpose furniture speaks abolition fluently. The elders there wrote generosity in the margins. A boy whose pockets were full of errands moved between doors as if chased by arithmetic. Errands run faster than suspicion. Arithmetic rarely loses a race. The code network flexed under a sudden rumor. A new deputy with fresh boots and a gift for dogs. Gifts are dangerous when they bark. Harriet rewrote her map with a rag and a thumb. She sent decoys to the Loud ferry with baskets that would never buy fish. Loud places swallow the wrong stories whole. The decoys fed them cheaply. The real route bent behind a cooperage that smelled of steam and cedar. Smell is camouflage when memory is doing the hunting. Cedar teaches lungs to lie convincingly. At the cooperage, a man rolled barrels with the solemnity of a deacon. Solemnity is the passport of honest work. Harriet borrowed a stamp. They ducked behind a half-bound cask as a pair of lawmen performed inspection theater. Theater sells tickets to itself. The audience applauded without enthusiasm. When the men moved on, Harriet led through a garden of rope coils and a geography of stacked crates. Coils behave like tame snakes when respected. Crates are chess pieces if you know the opening. At the wharf's end, the legal sky changed dialect. Jurisdiction spoke quieter across the water. Quiet makes better law. They would not take the obvious skiff or the friendly fisherman with comprehensible eyes. Obvious and friendly leave paperwork. Paperwork votes against you when you're absent. Instead, she aimed for a grain scow known to change owners by rumor and destination by boredom. Boredom is a reliable smuggler. It forgets to be dramatic. The scow's captain wore a face that had been audited by weather. Weather approves what it can't scold. He nodded at Harriet as if nodding were a craft he had honed. Payment was a problem, solved by inventory and leverage. Inventory looked like buttons and bread. Leverage looked like the captain's memory of a winter when help arrived wearing a brown scarf. Debts are bridges that can be crossed twice. While arrangements settled, the deputy with good boots tested the dock with a dog that respected grammar. Good boots make bad poems of men. The dog disagreed with the dock's narrative and began a rewrite. Harriet answered with a feint that borrowed confidence from rehearsal. She sent Josiah and the decoy boys toward a customs shed with a story about chair legs and a broken axle. Bureaucracy likes stories with nouns it can inventory. The deputy learned to enjoy the word manifest for 15 minutes. Enjoyment is a leash. Harriet walked Ruth under its slack. They moved low along a row of pilings where barnacles made a sound like sand reading. Reading out loud calms panic in children and grown men pretending otherwise. The dog wrote different sentences elsewhere. A bell on the Anglican steeple told a quarter hour no one had asked for. Bells are neutral until enlisted. This one, enlisted distraction. Under the bell, a fishmonger cursed a shipment that hadn't. Curses are civic theater. They draw crowds away from unimportant miracles. Harriet boarded the scow by not boarding it, which is to say, she became part of something being loaded that became part of something being towed. If you can define the edges, you can destroy them. She kept definitions blurry. Out in the channel, the wind negotiated between cold and colder. Negotiations went well. The river signed. Polaris hung steady, a notary public with infinite patience. Notaries are useful when history needs stamps. The stamp tonight said, "Forward." Halfway, a patrol boat lurched into view with the authority of a sermon arriving after dessert. Authority looks taller on water. Harriet let the scow become ignorance. The captain scratched his head at speed and remembered to be offended by taxes. Offense is a mask that fits every face. He wore it until the patrol lost interest. Ruth held the child's cap under her coat like a vow that had learned to travel. Vows do not weigh much if you believe them properly. She believed greedily. On the far bank, lamps wrote longer, friendlier sentences across the snow. Grammar changes borders faster than treaties. They stepped into better punctuation. The first door in the new dialect opened with a latch that expected gratitude and found it. Gratitude warmed its hands. The latch blushed metal. Inside, paper listed wages and addresses and skating ponds. Skating ponds are policy in this jurisdiction. The policy includes hot tea. Harriet set terms with her eyes. No names spoken aloud, no boasting, no telling the story in the middle of living it. Stories break when you brag. Living prefers understatement. A minister with tired shoes showed them a ledger that contained nothing a hunter could love. Ledgers can be taught modesty. He had been a good teacher. Josiah signed a name he had selected from a pocket of memory where sunlight lived. Selection is sovereignty at last. Ink cooperated like a friend. Ruth accepted a sewing job that paid hours instead of obedience. Obedience has poor benefits. Hours can be saved and spent later. The child's cap waited on a peg near the stove as if caps could grow taller. Objects expand when unafraid. The room allowed it. Harriet visited the window as if the night were an old colleague whose work she understood. Colleagues do not need to shake hands every time. She nodded at the dark and let it clock out. Word ran backward along the route that a group had crossed and the two decoy boys had overperformed their vocation. Overperformance is art in these streets. They received bread like medals. The code network, having bent all day, refused to break. Refusal is a sacred posture when gentle. Gentle is stronger than it advertises. Harriet revised her rules after the crossing, not because they failed, but because survival rewards editing. Rule 1. Rest is part of running. Rule 2. Memory is cargo. She delivered a final instruction in a tone that called it ordinary. Do not retell the route in any voice but a hymn. Hymns blur edges kindly. That night, snow rebuilt the dock's testimony one flake at a time. Testimony forgets if given enough weather. Forgetting is a form of forgiveness this country can afford. In the morning, a new map hung in the kitchen, hand-drawn and undetailed, the way safety prefers. Undetailed keeps doors on their hinges. Doors deserve that courtesy. Harriet counted breaths for the group a last time and let her hand fall. Counting retires when the room can do arithmetic without it. She had work east and west. Ruth touched the cap and wrote Leah a letter she could not send. Letters comfort writers more than readers. Comfort performs vital labor. Josiah coiled twine and taught it a new purpose, tying bundles that belonged to no overseer. Purpose grows when unobserved. He kept it in a drawer that smelled like cedar and policy. They were not saints, and this was not heaven. It was work that had survived the night. Survival is a respectable theology. It passes collection plates only for bread and buttons. Harriet left by the side door and greeted the day like a colleague she trusted enough to argue with. Argument between equals is a joy. She would spend the joy on someone still inside a map with too many edges. By noon, the decoys were back at school where arithmetic asked fewer questions than law. Arithmetic has manners. Law is learning. The scow captain forgot their faces on purpose and remembered the scarf by accident. Accidents write footnotes in good histories. He kept his quiet. The stevedore added a crate to his shift and subtracted a memory from his day. Balance sheets exist outside of banks. He slept well. The printer set the type for a sermon about honest work and left 3 letters misaligned as a private liturgy. Misalignment is sometimes the holiest part, he proofread with a smile. The meetinghouse cabinets closed on blankets that smelled like cedar and victory. Cabinets are chapels for finished nights. The elders locked them softly. By evening, the sky rehearsed stars for other travelers, whose names would survive only as pronouns and footfalls. Pronouns are loyal when history hesitates. Footfalls do not demand credit. Harriet studied Polaris and thanked it with her chin. Thanks that requires no witness is the most expensive kind. She paid gladly. The last mile of shadows had turned into sidewalks, and the code had entered a new grammar, one of wages, leases, and school bells. Grammar can be freedom if verbs are placed carefully. They began conjugating. The first morning under the new flag tasted like steam and bread. Paper spelled wages instead of ownership. Light came through the window as if it had been waiting for permission. Ruth learned the geography of safety by small errands. The market road remembered no overseers, and the river asked no questions. Even the wind stopped checking her pockets. At the seamstress's bench, she measured cloth that would not be counted in anyone's inventory but her own. Needles argued kindly with thread. The thimble kept secrets and did not charge interest. Josiah signed a name at the mill and felt his hand grow taller. Signatures learn posture when they are believed. The foreman nodded in the key of ordinary. They rented a room with walls that listened without repeating. The stove remembered their hunger and forgave it nightly. Chairs held them without interviews. At church, hymn books carried notes that sounded like doors on good hinges. Children practiced breath instead of silence. The sermon wore boots that could walk into Monday. News came by letter rather than rumor. Ink traveled farther than fear when given time and a stamp. Ruth unfolded sentences as if they might shatter and found none did. She wrote toward Leah the way sailors aim for a star they may never touch. Grief learned to stand without shouting. Hope took smaller bites and stayed longer at the table. Harriet visited as a rumor wearing boots. Rumors with boots deserved tea. She took hers hot and used steam for punctuation. Her rules had been copied into memory and pared down like a blade. Rest is part of running. Memory is cargo. She added one more. Tell it as music. So the church taught children to sing maps as history rather than as orders. Verses lost their edges and kept their truth. Metaphor retired from patrol and went into teaching. Names returned to mouths without flinching. Ruth spoke her own and watched the room fail to punish her. The room even made space. Winter loosened its argument 1 week at a time. The river forgot grudges and learned to praise. Praise prefers thaw. Work turned into habit, habit into dignity, dignity into the kind of quiet that does not apologize for itself. Quiet repainted doorframes. Doorframes welcomed the color. On market days, Ruth bargained without bowing. Her hands learned the grammar of coin. Grammar became fluent in fairness. Josiah joined a brass band that practiced on Thursdays behind the school. Music laid claim to streets where law had once stuttered. Children followed the drums as if following a future. The ledger at the meeting house kept an untidy column called Bread and Buttons. Bread and buttons were policy. Policy fed itself responsibly. At night, the boarding house keeper turned quilts with the care of an archivist. Patterns that once meant detours now meant birthdays and winter. Even triangles learned to rest. Letters arrived from south of the river like survivors with new shoes. They brought small stories that smelled of lie and courage. No headline could have told them better. Some stories did not arrive and would not. Absence remained a member of the household. The table set a place anyway. Ruth's letter to Leah became a ritual rather than an event. Rituals allow sorrow to punch a clock. Sorrow worked shifts and did not unionize. On Sundays, the congregation read names of the found and the missing. The list was longer than songs and shorter than truth. They sang the difference. Harriet's shadow stepped in when the door allowed and stepped out when the road called. She handled thanks the way blacksmiths handle sparks. Thanks burned bright and brief, and the shop stayed open. The town learned discretion as a civic subject. Children took turns carrying baskets that held only air and practice. Practice built muscle. A schoolteacher drew constellations on a slate and wrote navigation above them. No one said escape. The stars understood. Polaris kept its appointment. Laws on the far bank began to speak kinder English. Sentences stopped wearing manacles. Paragraphs learned mercy. The printing press carved out room for editorials that treated freedom as maintenance rather than miracle. Maintenance is unglamorous and undefeated. Ink kept regular hours. Work associations grew, then choirs, then dinner tables that seated difference without ceremony. Ceremony took a night off. Chairs did not mind. Across town, a museum trunk collected objects that refused to be merely things. A kettle that once was signal steamed in remembrance. A lantern blinked twice in every story told about it. Docents learned to guide without embalming. The past prefers breath to glass. Tours walk gently. Scholars argued footnotes as if saving lives with commas. Commas have saved lives. They kept arguing. In kitchens, older hands told the road in a dialect that did not scandalize children. The road answered by becoming bedtime. Sleep served as border security. Songs traveled in the open now and wore their meanings on the outside like Sunday coats. Coats still kept rain off. Meaning still kept people. When Ruth finally heard of a girl who might be Leah, a woman now, 2 towns over with a laugh like torn paper healed, she learned the speed of the body. Bodies outrun maps even when maps are trying. She arrived at a door that held more weather than wood. The woman who opened it had eyes that dismissed time as a poorly coached witness. Witness remembered better with help. Names proved themselves by not breaking. They sat with a distance between them that became a table and then became a quilt. Quilts function as treaties. Treaties held. Their stories clashed on minor details and agreed on weather. Weather often enjoys consensus. The room made room for that too. The letter that Ruth had written and rewritten retired in a drawer. Retirement suits good intentions, it still drew a pension of peace. Josiah mended chair legs for people who would never ask him for papers. Work introduced itself and stayed. Twine learned new knots that tied only what wanted tying. At a summer picnic, the brass band played a hymn people used to whisper. Children belted the chorus and missed none of the notes. Volume changed species. Harriet stood at the edge of the crowd like punctuation that refuses to over-explain. She listened for the part that still required weatherproofing. Every story has a leak somewhere. She told a boy at the lemonade barrel that the star does not move, but people do. The boy nodded with the sincerity of future memory. He would repeat it one day as if he had always known. In the meeting house ledger, an elder wrote a sentence that belonged in both present and future. It said simply, "Keep the door ajar." Doors understood instructions, and still there were nights when the city remembered how to be cruel. Memory does not consistently choose heroes. Vigilance learned to live on the top shelf where children could not reach it. Newspapers printed both virtues and failures with the impartiality of type. Type goes where it is sent. Editors tried to send it well. In courtrooms upriver, arguments rehearsed justice for later performances. Later arrived in boots, not wings. People applauded and then went back to work. A woman in a schoolhouse taught that songs are documents when paper lies. Paper lies with good penmanship. Songs countersign in breath. The museum added a plaque that said, "The road was built by hands that were not always famous." Fame is a weather pattern. Labor is geography. Geography endures. Ruth's house grew wider without moving. Visitors found chairs and use for them. Use is the truest hospitality. Leah, if Leah she was, brought a child who called every elder aunt until corrected and then not. Corrections softened like bread. Family becomes grammar when it is tired of being math. Winter returned and behaved itself. Rivers negotiated palely and then froze where agreed. No one wagered against them. On an evening of deep cold, the congregation sang the old hymn with the verse restored to metaphor. Metaphor appreciates being invited rather than conscripted. Windows fogged in approval. Harriet took the road again before dawn with a coat, a rule, and a silence. Silence wears well, the rule traveled light. Behind her, a town kept doing the ordinary things that rescue does after it changes clothes. Rescue looks good in aprons. It also fixes fences. At the edge of the quay, a bell tolled because time asked it to. Bells obey calendars and emergencies with equal grace. No emergency announced itself, which is also grace. Polaris held the sky together with its usual stubbornness. Stubbornness deserves kinder synonyms. History will invent them. Years changed their jackets. Children learned to call strangers neighbor without rehearsing. Neighbors learned both ears. The museum's lantern blinked twice whenever a docent told its story. Docents winked back and pretended science, not love, made it happen. The line at the door lengthened politely. A band played in a park named for someone who deserved it, and the notes walked shoes down paths that used to be patrol routes. Paths prefer music. They forget faster when sung to. Ruth kept sewing, slower, with fewer seams and more pauses. Pauses honor the cloth. Cloth remembers kindness. Josiah repaired a chair that had never been broken and charged the right amount anyway. Honesty concludes its sermons quickly. Customers left with lighter heads. Leah's household, by whatever name, brought a pie no holiday demanded. Holidays enjoy surprises. Pies legalize them. The kitchen legalized often. When storms came, the town checked each other's latches rather than the law's temperature. Latches did well. Laws studied. Children drew maps in chalk that had no chains for borders. Chalk erases easily and never forgets what it learned before rain. The drawings made adults honest. At funerals, they sang the old songs and meant them gently. Gentle does not mean small, it means correct. At weddings, they danced the road as if it had been a partner all along. The road behaved and did not step on toes. Shoes, polished for joy, forgave scuffs. Harriet aged the way weather ages, less dramatic, more permanent. Permanence is the slow courage. People visited her doorway with bread and gossip disguised as care. She whispered fewer rules and more blessings. Blessings scale better than orders. They also travel farther. On a clear night, she showed a child the dipper and taught the difference between guidance and command. The child laughed at the idea that stars could be bosses. Laughter revised the lesson without ruining it. The ledger at the meeting house eventually learned to yawn, but never to close. Yawning is what books do when satisfied. Closing is for stories that have stopped being useful. Museums upgraded their glass, schools repainted their walls, churches retired benches and kept the hymns. Retirement is not erasure. Memory draws a pension. The river did not grow kinder, it grew consistent. Consistency lets people plan. Plans reduce fear's salary. When the town votes each year, someone always says, "Leave room for strangers." Strangers keep the town young. Youth is another word for door. And when the song that carried them becomes only a melody people love, someone adds a line to remind the room it was once a map. The room nods as if it knew all along. Maybe it did. The legacy is not marble. It is errands and paydays and children who memorize constellations for pleasure rather than survival. Survival steps back without sulking. Pleasure takes a nervous bow and gets over itself. Ruth closes the window at dusk and leaves it unlatched. Unlatched is a policy that requires neighbors. The neighborhood agrees. Polaris remains at its post, indifferent and generous. Indifference, rightly placed, is a gift. Generosity, rightly practiced, is law. The night breathes and does not bristle. A lantern blinks on someone's porch because porches adore callbacks. 2 blinks, and then dark.